Let us continue our reading of Plato's first Alcibiades. Socrates asks, "But what? Have you ever seen a man who was wise in any art whatever, and yet was unable to make another man wise in the same art? As for instance, the master who taught you grammar was himself wise in that art, and in the same art he made you wise, as he also made every other person whom he undertook to teach, did he not?" "He did," says Alcibiades. "And you, who have learnt from him that kind of wisdom, would not you be able to teach it to another person?" "Certainly I should," says Alcibiades. "And is not the same thing true of a music master and of a master in the exercises?" "Perfectly so," says Alcibiades. "For this," says Socrates, "undoubtedly is a fair proof of the knowledge of such as are knowing in any subject whatever, their being able to produce their scholars, and to show these to be knowing in the same." Alcibiades says, "I think so too." Socrates, "Well then, can you name to me any one whom Pericles has made a wise man? His own sons has he, to begin with them?" Alcibiades says, "But what if the sons of Pericles were silly fellows, Socrates?" Socrates asks, "Clinias then, your brother?" Alcibiades, "Why should you mention Clinias, a man out of his senses?" Socrates, "Since Clinias then is out of his senses, and since the sons of Pericles were silly fellows, to what defect in your disposition shall we impute the little care taken by Pericles to improve you?" Alcibiades, "I presume that I myself am in the fault, that of not giving due attention to him." Socrates, "But name any person else, an Athenian or a foreigner, either a slave or a free man, who is not indebted to the instructions of Pericles for becoming wiser than he was, as I can name to you those who from the lessons of Zeno have improved in wisdom: Pythagoras, the son of Isolochus, and Callias, the son of Calliades, each of whom, at the price of 100 minae paid to Zeno, became eminent for wisdom." Alcibiades answers, "Now, by Jupiter, I cannot." Socrates says, "Very well. What then do you think of doing about yourself? Whether to rest, satisfied in the condition which you are now in, or to apply yourself to some means of improvement?" Alcibiades, "Concerning this, Socrates, I would consult with you, for I apprehend what you have said, and admit the truth of it. Those who have the administration of the state, except a few of them, seem indeed to me, too, not to have had a proper education." Socrates, "Well, and what conclusion do you draw from thence?" Alcibiades, "This, that if they, through their education, were well qualified to govern, a man who should undertake to enter the lists in contest with them ought to come to the engagement duly prepared by discipline and exercise, as in other combats. But now, seeing that such persons as these raw and undisciplined as they are, have attained to the management of state affairs, what need is there for a man to exercise himself in such matters, or to give himself the trouble of acquiring knowledge in them? For I well know that by dint of natural abilities I shall excel them by far and get above them. Socrates. Fie upon it, my fine young gentleman. What a declaration is this which you have made! How unworthy of your personal qualities and of the other advantages you are possessed of. Alcibiades. I should be glad, Socrates, to know why you think it unworthy of me, and in what respect. Socrates. You offer an affront, not only to the regard which I have for you, but to the opinion too which you have of yourself. How so? Asks Alcibiades. In that you think of entering the lists to contend with these men here at Athens. Alcibiades asks, whom then am I to contend with? Socrates. Does this question become a man to ask who thinks his mind to be great and elevated? Alcibiades. How do you mean? Is it not with these very persons that I am to stand in competition? Socrates. Let me ask you this question, whether, if you had any thoughts of commanding a ship of war, would you deem it sufficient for you to excel the mariners who were to be under your command in the skill belonging to a commander? Or, presuming yourself qualified with this due pre-excellence, would you direct your eye to those only whom you are in fact to combat against, and not as you now do to such as are to combat together with you? For to these men certainly you ought to be so much superior that they should never be your associates in competition against any, but your inferior assistants in combating against the enemy, if you really think of exhibiting any noble exploits worthy of yourself and of your country. Alcibiades. And such a thought I assure you that I entertain. Socrates. Is it then at all worthy of you to be contented with being a better man than your fellow soldiers, and not to have your eye directed toward the leaders of those whom you have to struggle with, studying how to become a better man than they, and employing yourself in exercises which are proper with a view to them? Alcibiades. What persons do you mean, Socrates? Socrates. Do you not know that our city is every now and then at war with the Lacedaemonians and with the great king? True, says Alcibiades. If then you have it in your mind to be the leader of this city, would you not think rightly in thinking that you will have the kings of Sparta and Persia to contend against? Alcibiades says, I suspect that you are in the right. Socrates. And yet you, my good sir, on the contrary, are to fix your view on Midias, a feeder of quails, and on other such persons who undertake to manage affairs of state, still wearing the badge of slavery, as the women would term it, in their souls, through their ignorance of the Muses, and not having yet thrown it off, but retaining their old sentiments and manners still barbarian, are come to flatter the people, and not to govern them. Ought you now to emulate these men whom I am speaking of, and disregard yourself? Ought you to neglect the acquiring of all such knowledge as only is acquired through learning, when you have so great a combat to sustain? Or ought you to omit the exercising yourself in all such actions as are well performed only through practice? Should you not be furnished with all the qualifications requisite for the government of the state before you govern it? Alcibiades: Indeed, Socrates, I believe you are in the right. But however, I imagine the commanders of the Spartan armies and the Persian monarch to be just such men as the others whom you have mentioned. Socrates: But, my very good sir, consider this imagination of yours, and what evils attend on it. In what respects? Asks Alcibiades. In the first place, what opinion concerning your antagonists do you think would engage you to take most care about yourself, whether the opinion of their being formidable or the contrary? Alcibiades: The opinion without doubt of their being formidable. Socrates: And do you think it would do you any harm to take care about yourself? Alcibiades: None at all, but on the contrary, great good. Socrates: The want of this great good, then, is one of the evils which attend on that imagination? It is true, says Alcibiades. Consider if there be not probably another too, and that is the falsity of it. Alcibiades asks, How do you prove that? Socrates: Whether is it probable that persons, the most excellent in their natural dispositions, are to be found amongst those who descend from ancestors the noblest, or is it not? Undoubtedly it is, says Alcibiades. And is it not probable, asks Socrates, that such as have excellent dispositions from nature, if they meet with a suitable education, should become accomplished in virtue? Alcibiades: Of necessity they must. Socrates: Let us consider now, in comparing their advantages with our own, whether the kings of Sparta and of Persia seem to be descended from meaner ancestors than we. Know we not that those are descendants of Hercules, and these of Achaemenes? That the begetting of Hercules is attributed to Jupiter, and the ancestry of Achaemenes to Perseus, the son of Jupiter? Alcibiades: And the family which I am of, O Socrates, descends from Eurysaces, and the descent of Eurysaces was from Jupiter. Socrates: And the family which I am of, my noble Alcibiades, descends from Daedalus, and the descent of Daedalus was from Vulcan, the son of Jupiter. But the pedigree of those with whom we set ourselves in comparison, beginning from the persons who now reign, exhibits a race of kings, all of them sons of kings, in a direct line quite up to Jupiter. Those whom I first mentioned, kings of Argos and Lacedaemon, the others kings of Persia perpetually, and often of all Asia, as they are at present. Whereas we are but private men, ourselves and our fathers. If you then were to boast of your ancestors and pompously say that Salamis was the hereditary dominion of Eurysaces, or to ascend higher in your ancestry, that Aeacus governed in his native country Aegina. Can you imagine how ridiculous you would appear in the eyes of Artaxerxes, the son of Xerxes? Consider besides whether we may not be found inferior to those great men, not only in pride of ancestry, but also in the care taken of our birth and breeding. Are you not sensible of the singular advantages which attend the progeny of the Spartan kings in this respect, that their wives have a guard of state appointed for them by the Ephori, to the end that no king of theirs may be the issue of stolen embraces, or have for his real father any other than a descendant of Hercules? And as to the Persian king, so greatly is he our superior with regard to this point, that none of his subjects entertain the least suspicion of his having any other father than the king, his predecessor. The consort thereof of the king of Persia is under no restraint, but that of her own dread of the evil consequences should she dishonor the king's bed. Further, when the king's eldest son, the heir apparent to the crown, is born, all the king's subjects in the city of his residence keep that day as an original feast day, and from thenceforth the anniversary of that day is celebrated with sacrifices and feasts by all Asia. But when we came first into the world, alas, Alcibiades, our very neighbors, as the comic poet says, little knew what happened. After this, the child is brought up, not by some insignificant nurse, but by the best eunuchs about the king's person. And these have it in their charge to take care of the royal infant in every respect, but especially to contrive the means of his becoming as handsome as possible in his person, by so fashioning his pliant limbs and giving such a direction to their growth that they may be straight. And for executing this office well, they are highly honored. When the young princes have attained the age of 7 years, they are provided with horses and with riding masters, and are initiated in the exercise of hunting. At 14 years of age, they are put into the hands of those who are called the royal preceptors, and these are chosen out from such as are deemed the most excellent of the Persians, men of mature age, 4 in number, excelling severally in wisdom, justice, temperance, and fortitude. By the first of these they are taught the magic of Zoroaster, the son of Oromazes, by which magic is meant the worship of the gods, and the same person instructs them likewise in the art of government. He who excels in the science of justice teaches them to follow truth in every part of their conduct throughout life. The person who excels in temperance inures the young prince not to be governed by sensual pleasure of any kind, that he may acquire the habits of a free man and of a real king. By governing first all his own appetites, instead of being their slave. And the fourth, he who excels in fortitude forms his royal pupil to be fearless and intrepid, for that his mind, under the power of fear, would be a slave. But Alcibiades, for your preceptor, Pericles appointed one of his domestics, too old to be fit for any other service, Zopyrus of Thrace. I would recount to you the other articles of the breeding and instruction given to your antagonists, if the narration would not be too long. And besides this, the articles already mentioned are sufficient indications of those others which they infer and draw along with them. But your birth, Alcibiades, your breeding and institution, or any other circumstances attending you, scarce any one of the Athenians is at all solicitous about, unless there be some man who happens to have an especial regard for you. Further, if you would consider the treasures of the Persian kings, the sumptuous furniture of their palaces and gardens, their wardrobes of apparel, the long trains of their garments and the fragrancy of their unguents, their numerous retinue of attendants and the rest of their magnificence, in comparing all this with what you have of the same kind yourself, you would evidently perceive how much you fall short of them, and would be ashamed at the comparison. If, on the other hand, you would consider the Lacedaemonians, their sobriety and modesty, how simple their way of living, and how easily they are satisfied, their magnanimity and observance of order, their manly endurance of pain and love of labor, their emulation to excel, and their love to honor, you would think yourself a child to them in all these excellencies. Besides this, if you make riches any part of your consideration, and in this respect imagine yourself a person of consequence, let us not pass over this point neither unexamined, if by any means you can be made sensible in what rank you stand. If you choose then to consider the Lacedaemonians with regard to wealth, you will find that what we have here in Attica falls far short of theirs. For the lands which they possess in their own country, as in Messenia, are such as that no person here would dispute their superiority in this respect, whether he considers the quantity or the value of the whole of those lands, the number of their other slaves besides such as the Helots, or the number of their horses and other cattle in the pasture grounds of Messenia. But setting aside all this, you will find that as to gold and silver, there is not so much amongst all the Grecians as there is amongst the Lacedaemonians in private hands. For gold and silver have now for many generations been flowing into them from all parts of Greece, and often too from foreign countries, but there is no reflux any way. That therefore which the fox said to the lion in a fable of Aesop's may justly be applied to them. The footsteps of money coming in to Lacedaemone are easy to be discovered, as being all turned towards it. But the tracks of money going out of it are nowhere to be discerned. Thus it may easily be conceived that of all the Grecians, the richest in gold and silver are the Lacedaemonians, and that of all the Lacedaemonians the richest is their king. For of such comings in, a larger share and oftener is received by kings than other men. And besides this, the taxes paid by the Lacedaemonians to their kings bring them in a large revenue. But whatever wealth the Lacedaemonians have, though great if compared with that of any other Grecians, yet in comparison with the riches of the Persians, and especially of their king, 'tis nothing. For I once heard a man of credit, who had been at the capital city of Persia, say that in going up to it, he traveled almost a day's journey through a large and fertile territory, which the inhabitants of it called the Queen's Girdle, that there was another extensive tract of land called the Queen's Vale, and that many other fair and fruitful countries were appropriated to provide the rest of the Queen's apparel, each of those countries having its name from that part of the apparel which the revenue of it furnished. So that were any person to tell the Queen Mother, Amastris, the consort formerly of Xerxes, that the son of Dinomache had it in his head to lead an army against her son, and were she told at the same time that Dinomache's whole attire might be worth perhaps 50 minae, supposing it to be of the most costly kind, and that this son of hers had land in the district of Erchia, containing not so much as 300 acres, she, I suppose, would wonder in what kind of things this Alcibiades could place so much confidence as to think of contending with Artaxerxes. And I imagine that she would say it is impossible that this man should undertake such an affair with any other confidence than what he places in the prudence and skill which he is master of. For that the Grecians have nothing else worthy of account. Because if she was to hear further that this same Alcibiades, in the first place, had not completed the 20th year of his age, in the next place, that he was utterly uninstructed, and besides this, that when a friend of his advised him first to acquire the knowledge, the prudence, and the habits necessary for the execution of his designs, before he offered to attack the king, he refused to hearken to this advice, and said that even in his present condition he was prepared sufficiently. I believe she would be astonished, and would ask what kind of a thing it could be then in which the youth put his confidence. Upon this, were we to tell her in his handsome and fine person, in his birth and family, in his riches, and in the natural faculties of his mind, she would think us, Alcibiades, out of our senses, when she reflected on all the advantages which her son enjoyed of the same kinds. No less do I imagine that Lampido, daughter of Leotychidas, wife of Archidamus, the mother of Agis, who all of them in their turns succeeded to the crown of Sparta, she too would wonder, in reflecting on their greatness, were she told that you had taken it into your head to make war against her son, so ill instructed as you are. And now, do you not think it shameful if the wives of our enemies consider more prudently for us than we do for ourselves what sort of persons we ought to be before we venture to attack such enemies? Hearken, therefore, my good sir, to the advice which I give you, in agreement with the Delphic inscription, know thyself. Since your antagonists are to be not those whom you imagine, but these whom I have told you of, and these you can never excel in any other point than skill and application, in which articles, if you are found deficient, you will fail of that reputation and renown, as well with Grecians as barbarians, which I think you long for, with more ardor than any other man does for whatever is the object of his wishes. Here will end this reading from Plato's First Alcibiades.